will stand here and welcome everyone to the Free Russia Foundation Brussels office. I'm Roland Freudenstein. I'm not that freshly minted. I've been director for already 4 months, I counted. Seems like it's today that I joined. But so welcome again to the West and Putin. Where did we go wrong? Well, before I delve into the topic, I would like to introduce our speakers here. No, before that, I have to say the following, a couple of technical remarks. This is on the record, quite literally. It will be recorded and will be put online in a couple of days. The idea of this series, of which this debate here is the third in a row, is to have civilized disagreement, which is rare in Brussels. Right? Normally, you've got 7 panelists and a moderator, and everybody agrees, and the audience falls asleep. This is not going to happen here. If anybody needs coffee, the black cantinas over there are coffee, and the greens are water for tea. All right. Now, our speakers today are myself and Dr. Zachary Paikin, who is an independent researcher on international security, author of many books, but he is also based in Geneva at the Center for Security Policy and non-resident fellow of the Institute for Peace and Security, tied to the Quincy Institute also, so many ties to the think tank scene. I met Zach here in Brussels about a year and a half ago, late in 2022, when there were about 120 military officers from across the world brought here by a Royal College from London. And they wanted some interesting debate on the Ukraine war and relations between Russia and the West. And it ended up being Zach and me, and we gave them a 1.5 hour run for their money, quite literally. I think we got standing ovations at the end. We were not the only people in the room standing. Anyway, so I want to do a similar debate further down in time and with a similar topic. But before we come to the topic, we have Dimitar Lilkov, who is a senior research officer in the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies, where I used to work. Actually, I was his boss for a short time. Yeah. And then he's still alive. So Dimitar is going to moderate this. But that's all for the technicalities. And I will just say, Putin in the West, where have we gone wrong? Do you remember what happened exactly 1 year ago? We were all eating popcorn. Or actually, by this time, we had finished the popcorn because Prigozhin's little mutiny, which didn't seem so little at the time, was over. But for about 10 hours or so, we were excited. But some other people in Moscow were also excited, but in a different way. I heard the tweet. I remember the tweet from a famous Russian exile journalist, Margarita Simonyan fled Moscow in women's clothes. Make of that what you will. But so just to emphasize how dramatic things can get very, very quickly in Russia. But today we debate some question actually more focused on the past than the present, but it's not only for historians. It is actually something that will point very strongly towards which way the West should deal with Russia in the future. And for that, we need to analyze what went right and what went wrong. And that's what we're about to do. And with that, I hand over to you, Dimitar. Sorry, maybe I'll close the door.
Sure. Thanks, Roland.
Yes, you start.
Pleasure to be here. My name is Dimitar, as Roland mentioned, from the Wilfried Martens Centre. For those who do not know us, we are the political foundation official think tank of the European People's Party, the European Centre Right. And I guess last year, our organization had the dubious honor to be officially blacklisted by the Russian Federation, by the General Secretary, for spreading propaganda against the Russian Federation and helping the Ukrainian regime. And guess I'm today doing exactly this. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Let's just kick it off, I guess. Housekeeping rules, live discussion on the record. We'll have interventions by each speaker, have a little clash of views, and I will also invite you at the first opportunity to give very brief questions, maybe if there's something especially emotional or heated up, and of course, moving on to a proper Q&A session afterwards. I guess without further ado, Zachary, please kick us off.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitar, and thank you, Roland, for the kind invitation to do this with you again. It's really great to be back in Brussels, where I worked for a little over 2 years. So thanks for having me. I should qualify as well that I'm no longer affiliated with the Geneva Center for Security Policy as of this month, but retain affiliations with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and the Quincy Institute. But I am speaking tonight purely in a personal capacity and not in any of those affiliations that I currently hold. So just to kick things off, I want to make clear that I don't associate myself with the John Mearsheimer argument about poking the bear. I think that post-Cold War history is more complicated than these sort of simplistic narratives of did we appease Putin too much or did we poke the bear too much, etc. I think that monocausal explanations in general are relatively stupid. I think that a more accurate reading of the past 30 years of history is that the West and Ukraine and Russia all made certain decisions that made war's return to Europe thinkable once again. But what we did wrong, and I guess the question tonight is to litigate what we did wrong in the West. We did build an institutional order in Europe in the post-Cold War era that effectively excluded Russia. Now, this may have happened deliberately, it may have happened by sheer inertia, it may have happened due to reaction to events. I can think, for example, of the intervention in Yugoslavia in 1999, right? This is just, the fact that NATO had the capabilities necessary to do what needed to be done, and therefore, in reaction to events, a certain pattern of relations or interaction developed between Russia and the West. But nonetheless, NATO and the EU, as a result of those factors, became the European security order's dominant institutions. That's not necessarily how things needed to end up. It's not manifest destiny, as it were, from where things stood in 1990. But over the course of subsequent years and decades, that is what happened. NATO and the EU emerged as the preeminent security, political, and economic institutions in Europe. And the problem is that Russia cannot join those two institutions. Those two institutions are built in such a way that, whatever we may officially say, Russia will never, ever be a member of NATO or of the European Union. That's just the reality. So I think that that's structural reality. The fact that these two dominant institutions in Europe that could not accommodate Russia, I think that that is a more important fact to keep in mind than this binary debate about were we too tough on Russia, were we not tough enough on Russia? And then we need to transcend that binary and look at the structural realities of the post-Cold War European security order. So let me emphasize on top of this, the fact that you have these two institutions, in the European security order that could not accommodate Russia means that dialogue and engagement in and of themselves with Russia doesn't transcend this structural reality, this structural exclusionary reality of a European security order that in effect excludes Russia, right? The structural reality of having those two institutions is that either Russia has a veto, in which case the institutions lose their raison d'etre to some extent, right? Because the whole point of having these institutions or these clubs is that you're a member of the club, and therefore being a member of the club comes with certain privileges, and only members of the club should have the right to have a veto. So if Russia has a veto, it undermines the raison d'etre of the club. But if Russia is not accorded a veto, then everyone else in Europe, in effect, has a veto except for Russia. And Russia is the most powerful country, in effect, on the European continent. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And that is a product of the structural realities of post-Cold War European history, right? And on top of that, another consequence of the structural reality is that once member states agree, among NATO member states or EU member states, it becomes very difficult after that, once the compromises have been reached between all those different members, to then turn around and to further dilute or change that position in negotiations with Russia. So there might be dialogue, there might be engagement, but it's mostly formal rather than substantive. And so the reality, again, is that you have a European order that, in effect, excludes Russia. Now, a lot of people will turn around and say, oh, no, but there was dialogue. We engaged with them. But it was formal rather than substantive. As some would say, Russia's invited to the hors d'oeuvre. It's not really invited to the dinner where the actual decisions are made. Just to highlight, moving along sort of in history very quickly, you know, some of the mistakes that we did tangibly make in terms of events and not just in terms of structures. You're all familiar with shock therapy. You know, this turned Russians against liberalism and towards Putin as someone who was promising to restore order after a decade of chaos in which Russians literally lost years off of their life expectancy. The country was literally falling apart and it had a leader that was mocked roundly on the world stage. In 1999, we're all familiar with the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia, which, you know, beyond being technically a violation of international law, was also an instance of NATO operating out of area, not in response to an attack. So not, you know, the invocation of Article 5, and therefore built in this image in the minds of many in Moscow that NATO is not purely a defensive alliance. And so no matter how much, you know, Western capitals and folks here in Brussels would protest that NATO is, of course, only a defensive alliance, you know, that message very much rang on deaf ears, no matter, you know, the humanitarian aims that we were claiming to pursue. And then 2008, of course, we're not even going to get into, you know, what's happened more recently, but 2008, you saw unilateral recognition by most Western countries of Kosovo over the heads of a UN Security Council resolution where Russia has a voice, which was supposed to be upholding the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia, then Serbia. And the West effectively assuming the UN's responsibilities in that context. So basically taking decisions out of bodies where Russia has a vote, such as the UN Security Council, and deciding to proceed unilaterally. And at the same time as this happens in 2008, you also have the Bucharest Summit, very famously in the NATO Bucharest Summit, in which the prioritization of alliance unity, it seems, takes precedent over what is actually the best decision for the future of the European security order, right? You have an attempt to forge a compromise between the United States that wants to bring Ukraine into NATO, France and Germany at the time that were very wary of doing so. And so we come up with language that says Ukraine will one day become a member of NATO. It's not a question of if, but when. However, we're not actually going to do anything tangible in the meantime to make that happen. We're not going to issue a membership action plan, etc. So not only is this actually the prioritization of alliance unity over strategic decision-making, it's the prioritization of the principle that Russia shouldn't have a veto over NATO decision-making. And that way you have to come up with a decision that was so strategically poor that what it telegraphed to the Russians was, one day in the future, we don't know when, but at some point, we're going to kick you out of your naval base in Sevastopol and we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO. But in the meantime, if you'd like to take military action to stop that from happening, there's nothing we're going to do to prevent you because Article 5 does not extend to Ukraine just yet. And all of this was done at a time when 80% of the Ukrainian population was against joining NATO. 3 times as many folks in Ukraine were either in favor of neutrality or at the time, even an alliance with Russia, than in favor of joining NATO. So just to wrap up here, the question as it relates to Russia is one of status concerns rather than security. You hear this all the time, this narrative of poking the bear, that it's about, you know, NATO expansion and security concerns. There are elements of that discourse is there, it's real, the security threats are perceived, they're not entirely contrived, but more than anything else, Russia has been driven by status concerns in the European security order, the status of being a great power, being recognized as a legitimized great power, and that is something that we did not accord them because of the construction of a European security order that de facto excluded it, right? The perception in Moscow that an order was effectively built without it. And my core argument to wrap up here is that we cannot change Russia's perception of its own status, as much as we would like to. I know there are many folks in the West who think that if only Ukraine were given enough military equipment, it could win this war. And if you win the war, you end Russian imperialism once for all and the imperial mindset once and for all. That is just not true. We do not know that. That is a gamble. That is a bet. There's every possibility that Russia would react to that with, doubling down on imperialism, revanchism, resentment, etc. We cannot predict the future. And again, a full-fledged Ukrainian victory in this war at this point is incredibly unlikely. And even if it were to happen, it's incredibly risky given the escalation risks. So it is a hugely unlikely proposition to say, let's back Ukraine to the hills. We can end Russian imperialism once for all and build the European security order that we want that doesn't have Russia's input. So to summarize here, at some point in the future, there is going to be some kind of new European security order. And that new European security order will need to legitimate Russia's declared interests to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent. And if we don't do that, there will be no security in Europe. That is the reality, whether we like it or not. So we need to move forward, not on the approach that we've had over the past 30 years, which is an approach based on lecturing one another about what the rules are, and lawyerizing foreign policy, and competitively invoking rules against one another, as Patrick Porter would say. Rather, what we need to do is we need to focus on what we can get in future negotiations over the shape of the European security order. That would be a more pragmatic approach. It's a more pragmatic approach to achieving peace, stability, and security on Europe in the interests of all actors. Thank you.
Great, thanks for this.
Hey, you can applaud.
Yeah. I fully agree with the point you're making about the fact that we cannot change Russia's perception right now. We cannot tell it how to feel. We cannot satisfy the imperialism and the revanchism through our conduct. I give you that, and this is a well-built argument about the structure of the security order post-Cold War, even before that. The question is, isn't the structure that you're referring to, isn't there some sense of inevitability? That we need to build it as such so that the Russians are not in, they don't have veto power over our decisions as they have in the UN Security Council. And we've had the whole history of the Cold War telling us that, working the system doesn't, move us much, especially when there's global conflict. So isn't this security order inevitable in a way? And wasn't there an inherent belief that slowly we accommodate the Russians, early 2000s, fight against terrorism, for example. We engage in a strategic dialogue, which you say maybe is void, but you engage in a strategic dialogue that on global issues we move forward. One of the mainstream parties in Brussels had a dialogue with Putin. We tried to open the door, have a little reset. So, long story short, wasn't this inevitable? And don't you think that the strategy was to accommodate them slowly but surely if they improve their track record?
Okay, so I think I got 3 questions in there. First of all, on the question of a veto. Russia does have a veto, not just in the UN Security Council, but also in the OSCE, which proceeds on the basis of consensus, right? And the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that the hierarchy between these different institutions in the European security order changed in a direction over the course of the post-Cold War era to Russia's detriment, right? So the institutions in which it had a veto, such as the OSCE, became a sideshow. Basically, an organization that talks about soft issues like, election integrity and media freedom and stuff like that, and mostly focuses on second-tier countries. So second-tier issues in second-tier countries in Eastern Europe, whereas, the big prize basically goes to NATO and the EU, where Russia's excluded, right? So that's the perception. Russia wanted to have, a post-Cold War order in which the OSCE was the preeminent security institution on the continent. Did it have real tangible ideas about how to make that happen? Not necessarily. I think Russia knew a lot more about what it didn't want rather than what it did want, and that was part of the problem. But nonetheless, I think the point still stands. On engaging after 9/11, the argument could easily be flipped. From the Russian perspective, they were saying, we're going to let the Americans come in and operate out of Central Asia so they can wage their war in Afghanistan, which is in our shared interest, by the way. And in exchange for that, they should do us a favor and maybe not interfere in our near abroad in Eastern Europe, right? We give you a favor, you do us a favor, right? And that's part of where friendly relations are defined differently on both sides. Katrin many years ago had a very good article on this for ECFR, in which she said that our definition of friendly relations is a Russia that becomes more like us, one that becomes more democratic, more liberal, etc. Their definition of friendly relations was, let's trade favors. You do me a favor, I'll do it, and we'll return the favor, right? So already there was some miscommunication there about how to define friendly relations in the first place, which is a good segue to your final question. Was all of this inevitable? Yes and no. I mean, to the extent that structures do determine outcomes, yes, but there's still room for agency in that story. And within the constrictions of the structures that we have, we can still make decisions to make a bad situation less bad potentially. Are we living right now in the worst of all possible worlds? Maybe not. Maybe NATO expansion helped to blunt some of the even worse alternatives. Maybe, Central European countries would have become ultra-nationalist, irredentist, etc. There was an argument to be made that by, bringing that first wave of countries into NATO in 1999, that you were, in effect, doing something that was in the common interest of both Western Europe and the United States and Russia. That started to change when NATO expansion proceeded a little bit further, and the interests were more zero-sum as we got closer to Russia's border. So it wasn't entirely inevitable, and certainly was not inevitable because Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine as well, and that was not inevitable. He could have chosen another course of action. He could have chosen a more diplomatic path. Would it have resolved his core and the rest of the Russian elite's core, concerns about the shape of the European security order? No, it would not have. But nonetheless, Russia could have preserved more room for strategic maneuverability, between the West and China and the global South, and continue with some kind of adversarial relationship with the West. But maybe that, has not taken us down the course that we have right now. So, certain decisions still very much are contingent, even though structures do impose certain constraints.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for this. I actually had a fourth question about previous NATO enlarged ways, but you preempted it, so thank you for that. Roland, lots of stuff already on the plate. Please give us your initial argument, and maybe you can even have the pleasure to directly respond even now. So
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dimitar. Let me just say two things before I even start my prepared statement, and that is, Zach, I think broadly speaking, Russia excluded itself would be one of my premises, and the other one would be that a Russian veto equals lack of agency for the democracies around Russia. To avoid the word post-Soviet or something. So these are two things that I think are self-evident, as the Declaration of Independence puts it. Now to my argument. I think, to put it in one sentence, we signaled weakness in the face of aggression, thereby inviting further aggression. All right, that's what we did wrong. So, slightly more detail. If we had taken the sanctions we took in 2014 after the invasion of Georgia in 2008, then the aggression of 2014 wouldn't have happened, not in this form. If we had taken action like in 2022, after the full-scale invasion, already in 2014, then the full-scale invasion of 2022 wouldn't have happened. And right now, if we had properly armed Ukraine as soon as possible in 2022, the war might very well be over and Putin might very well be passed. And I'm concretely referring to the debates that we had over which kind of weapon systems go to Ukraine, because Ukraine was on a broad offensive at the end of 2022. And a counteroffensive of a much larger scale would have been possible at the time. Okay, more in detail now. What were some of the turning points where the West made concrete mistakes? First, not to recognize the explosiveness of Putin's planning and thinking in 2005. State of the Union, geopolitical catastrophe. In other words, when Putin said in his State of the Union address that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union because of the Russian minorities that would now be outside of Russia, right? To not see what he was saying there, and to think that maybe he doesn't mean the way it sounds, was one of those mistakes. I'll give you 9 others. 2007, Munich Security Conference, the new Cold War speech by Putin, which was again kind of taken with, at the Munich Security Conference itself, Western leaders said kind of, no, but that's not the way we see it, and so on. And again, it was not treated the way it was meant as a serious threat. The Bronze Soldier attack, by the way, this still belongs to the 2007 point. The Bronze Soldier attack, the first full-scale hybrid attack against a Western country, Estonia in this case, 2007. It's kind of shock, disbelief, but no actual, zero actual consequences in policy, right? NATO-Russia Council continues. Economic cooperation completely continues. Any kind of counterattack, any kind of thinking that the West might actually build up some kind of deterrence against something like this happening in future, zero. Third point, the Bucharest NATO summit, already mentioned by Zach. You know, the funny thing about that is both the Hawks and the Doves can totally agree that the solution that was actually taken was the worst of all worlds. I still think that the fact that Germany and France acted as if in reaction to conversations between Sarkozy, Merkel, and Putin, already that goes back to what I said initially. It was, it was de-escalation which signaled the other side that they can push further. That in itself was already a big mistake. The reset, that's number 4. The reset, Obama's reset vis-a-vis Russia. Now, like, okay, we've had some trouble in Georgia. Oh, by the way, of course, that nothing happened after Georgia's invasion. After the invasion of Georgia is a bad mistake. And then the reset, like, okay, our relations got a little bit bad, but let's go back to cooperation here. 2012, the crackdown on the protests in Russia, the foreign agents law, not connecting the dots in the sense that oppression at home and aggression abroad are actually two sides of the same coin in Putin's Russia. That was not understood at the time. Again, cooperation went on regardless of what was actually happening inside of Russia. The goose stepping towards a fascist society was not recognized. War in Syria, not going into detail, also happened around 2012. 2014, a slap on the wrist in terms of sanctions, some personal sanctions, a couple of economic ones, but really nothing that really hurt Russia, the Russian economy in any way. And the refusal to arm Ukraine. That Angela Merkel, confronted with what happened recently, said that, the Minsk agreement, there was no alternative. And besides that, we wanted to, in 2014, we wanted to give Ukraine time to arm itself. Angela Merkel personally took care to absolutely minimize any possibility for Ukraine to arm itself. They got a couple of ex-Soviet supplied Warsaw Pact material from a couple of Eastern flank countries. That was all that Germany and a couple of other countries like France were permitting their partners to deliver to Ukraine. And this was only happening on bilateral basis and so on. But she personally made sure that Ukraine couldn't arm itself. And the fact that she's saying today that I wanted to give them time to arm themselves is absolute nonsense, right? And that's still friendly as an expression. Nord Stream 2, do I have to say anything? Nope. Okay, next point, 8. December 2021, Russia quite openly said that if you want peace in Ukraine, and the troops were already amassing around the borders of Ukraine. If you want peace in Ukraine, then NATO has to essentially go back to the status quo of 1997. That means before the first wave of Eastern enlargement of NATO. And that goes back to this Russian veto of agency. If Russia says that NATO enlarged itself against our will, yes, that was a NATO decision upon the request of democracies that had good reasons to feel threatened by Russia. You know that even before Putin came to power, there are about 27 recorded cases of energy blackmail and other forms of pressure by Yeltsin's Russia against countries like Lithuania and other neighboring countries of the Russian so-called Federation. So, you know, revisionism. And again, the West continued emphasizing dialogue. Leaders fell over themselves to visit Putin in Moscow at this ridiculous table and so on. After Putin had demanded this, right? To keep the NATO-Russia Council going until basically Russia itself refuses to participate. And finally, the hesitation to arm Ukraine in 2022, and to properly arm Ukraine in 2022, and I've already talked about that. So always behind the curve, always late. So 4 systemic failures, this as long as it takes versus whatever it takes. That's actually the last point I talked about. What should have been the motto would be, we give Ukraine whatever it takes. Maybe not to push out the last Russian soldier from the last square kilometer of occupied territory, but to achieve a situation of military superiority in the occupied lands of Ukraine. We didn't do that. You know, as long as it takes doesn't say anything. NATO enlargement, legitimate Russian security interests, no regard for the agency of democracies. And let's make one thing clear. I mean, Russia itself has stated what the goal of this special military operation are. That is not to prevent or undo NATO enlargement. It is to destroy Ukraine. If you don't believe it, look at the denazification handbook published in RIA Novosti, 4th of April, 2022, where they say clearly that to even claim that Ukraine is an actually existing nation means you're a Nazi, and that you need to go to a filtration camp, and the leaders of that need to be eliminated, so that Ukraine doesn't exist as a nation. This is not about NATO expansion at all. Third point, we always draw red lines for ourselves. We say what we're not going to do, and we leave no strategic ambiguity. Emmanuel Macron was on a very, very good track when he said, I'm not taking anything off the table. Doesn't mean I send soldiers to Ukraine tomorrow, but I don't rule it out. Keep Putin guessing like he's keeping us guessing all the time. And finally, what I call the cult of geopolitics, this belief that, you know, ultimately deep down, all the big superpowers have those spheres of influence and reduced sovereignty for their neighbors. Well, tell me one thing. Why is it that in Mexico and Canada, no person, no politician in their right state of mind wants to join the Eurasian Union? I mean, there are, broadly speaking, two possible explanations for that. One is that the boys and girls in Langley are such geniuses that everybody who counts in these two countries is somehow on the payroll or blackmailed by compromat produced by the CIA. It's a possibility, though I think it would be an undue compliment to the capabilities of the guys in Langley. And the other possibility is that the US has, with all due respect to imperialist reflexes there too, but that the US has in recent decades been doing something right in relation to its neighbors. So that this kind of Mearsheimer, sorry, I'm not accusing you of Mearsheimer, but the Mearsheimer question is, well, what would we do if Mexico went kind of pro-Russian or something? No, they are not, and nobody in Mexico wants that, actually. And there's a reason for it. So this equalization doesn't work. Last point, Normandy. We celebrated the 80th anniversary of Le Débarquement, as it's called in French, a couple of weeks ago this month. And I think there are 3 questions that, you know, I mean, if you look at what Zelensky said in the French Assemblée, and you summarize it in 3 questions, then it would be the following ones. Can we, Western democracies, still identify a lethal threat and call a spade a spade? Can we say this is so bad and so dangerous that we have to fight it? Second, are we still able to make sacrifices? And that includes material sacrifices and compromise on our prosperity and killing and dying. And third, can we maintain unity among Western countries? And the answer in 1944 on all three questions was yes. Will it be yes in the future? The jury's out. That's it.
Let's dwell a bit on the Western naivete or appeasement as you referred to it. Specifically in Europe, let's maybe keep the US away from this and look at our own backyard. This process of accommodating the Russians, was it because we were very cozy in this relationship because of the cheap energy, the cheap raw materials, all the economic trade, potential, spillovers? Were we simply afraid in terms of the Russians? What stood behind this collective naivete?
It's like everything important. There's not one. Everything important that happens on this planet has more than one reason.
Sure.
So fear was a factor. Interestingly, if you look at, for example, German opinion polls, and your question also refers to my country, Germany, to a great extent. Opinion polls in Germany in 2014, before and after Crimea and Donbass. The funny thing is that the popularity of cooperating with Vladimir Putin went from 9 to 8 points. Okay, the good news is that it was very low anyway. The bad news is that appeasement continued to be Germans' reaction, even though they didn't like Vladimir Putin, right? Maybe in the East a little bit more than in the West, but all over, there was always a minority of Germans who liked Vladimir Putin. So there are other reasons. And yes, fear was one factor. Greed was another one. The famous German business model, cheap energy from Russia, cheap security from the US, and unlimited export markets, predominantly in China, right? All three under a big question mark. But and then there are some country-specific factors here. I mean, the French classe politique obsession with this kind of cultural Pushkin and Tolstoy and the brotherhood of intellectuals who actually read novels in the metro and stuff like that, Yeah, as if in Paris. It really happens in Moscow still. Germany. Oh my God. And don't get me started. Yes, the underdogs, the noble savage, the nations to whom we owe a debt because of World War II, because of Gorby, and he helped Germany to unite, and so on and so on. And there was the illusion that, through this strategic partnership and economic relations and investment and trade, Russia would be like China, would come closer to strengthening the rule of law and becoming a democracy over time. Actually, not only did this not happen, something else did happen. We became corrupt. Russia exported strategic corruption to the West. So not everybody failed. Strategic partnership was not a total failure. Actually, Russia was successful in exporting its crime and corruption to the West. And, so there are numerous reasons. Fear, and Zach mentioned escalation as a possibility. Well, Putin knows this. I mean, this is the Leningrad backyard hooligan tactics of the early 60s. Is, you know exactly where it hurts, because Putin was a comparatively short and skinny fellow, and he had to know exactly the point which to hit, and he also had to see the fear in the eyes of his opponent. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, he is richly rewarded in the West in general and in Germany, and specifically in Germany.
Yeah. Back to you, Zach, and we mentioned 2014, and I think this was one of the, for sure, like breaking points. But again, referring to our argument and moving to 2014, there's an invasion, lives been lost, clear red lines have been broken, escalation like never before, at least in the last 20-something years. How does your thesis hold here when we see a clear act of aggression? And how can we, post 2014, talk about accommodating this belligerent actor in a new security order or in a changed security?
Sure. So I'm going to respond just to two or three things that Roland said,
Sure.
and in doing so, I'm going to come to your question.
Great.
That's all right. So first of all, the notion that Russia excluded itself, I don't deny that Russia did many things that helped to sour relations with the West. I don't deny that at all. I mentioned that at the outset of my presentation. We're all to blame for, I'm not going to judge, to which extent, who's most responsible for who brought us to the eve of the war. Certainly Putin is responsible for invading Ukraine, but on the eve of the war, there's lots of blame to go around. But that doesn't obviate what I said before, which is that, Russia was not going to be able to join NATO and the EU. In that sense, it was excluded by definition. Unless you know something that I don't, that there was, a serious plan at some point to make Russia a member of NATO or the EU, Russia was going to be excluded to some extent because it sets up this catch-22 of either, everyone in Europe has a veto except for Russia, which doesn't work, or Russia has a veto and we can't allow that because it undermines the whole raison d'etre of our institutions. So that's the way I see things. Which brings me to the question of the veto. And as you say, if Russia has a veto, it undermines the self-determination of countries on the Russian periphery. I think that's not true for a couple of reasons. First of all, because we also have self-determination. We have the right to say, we don't want to bring Ukraine into NATO. And that's our sovereign right as a sovereign country, as a democracy, as a people with self-determination to make the decision that we don't want to bring Ukraine into NATO. So no country has an inalienable right to be able to join a military alliance. They can aspire all they want, and that's great if they want to aspire, but we also have to make the decision that's in the best interest of our own security. And beyond that, even if we take that argument and put it aside, Russia still has a de facto veto, and that de facto veto is called war. They have a veto to the extent that we are not prepared to risk war with Russia, right? To the extent that we are not prepared to risk war with Russia over Ukraine, they have a veto over whether or not Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. And that's why Ukraine, for the second straight NATO summit, we're about to see it in Washington, is not going to make any progress on the tangible pathway into NATO. It's simply not going to happen. And it is just incredibly irresponsible of us, for Ukrainians and for European security as a whole, for us to be able to dangle, for us constantly to be dangling in front of the Ukrainians the tantalizing prospect of NATO membership, when it's simply not going to happen. It's only going to encourage the war to continue on for longer than it otherwise has to. And the third point is just in response to the argument that you made a few times of, if we had done X, then Y wouldn't have happened. And here we come to your question. You don't know that. That's a counterfactual, but you don't know for a fact that if only we had done X, then Y certainly wouldn't have happened. It could be that things would have been even worse if we had done X, right? So let me give you an example about 2014, right? All accounts at the time suggested that Putin was under pressure from his nationalist flank in Russia to go further and effectively to bisect Ukraine altogether, to take all of Novorossiya, or maybe half of Ukraine, who knows. This was the argument at the time, and he, to some extent, was one of the guys who thought that making a deal with the West was still possible, right? So you have to put, the shoe on the other foot as well, right? How do we make a deal with them? They're asking the question, how do you make a deal with us, right? And at this time, there was little trust on both sides. And both, especially the Western side, was saying at the time, there can be no business as usual. Well, the more you repeat this mantra that there's no business as usual, the less and less trust there's going to be on the other side. And the more you end up with this seemingly self-fulfilling prophecy, So to sort of wrap this up here, I think the problem is that, Ukraine is a core interest for Russia. It is clear that they are prepared to fight over the question of Ukraine's geostrategic orientation, and we are not prepared to fight. And that's why the mantra of whatever it takes, it sounds good, it would be nice, but it's not going to work because we're not prepared to fight. And at the end of the day, Ukraine doesn't have enough, forget about weapons, it doesn't have enough people, it doesn't have enough men to be able to win this fight. Unless we are prepared to fight, to put our own men and women on the front lines and to risk our own security as a result, it's not gonna happen, right? Ukraine's not gonna win the war. I wish it were not the case, but it's just the reality, right? Now, your argument might be in response to that, if only we were really committed to this, if we were committed to putting our men and women on the front line, if we were committed to the whatever it takes mantra, then Russia would back down, because Russia wouldn't dare mess with us, right? They're in a game of chicken here, and we're the more powerful actor. Again, you don't know that, right? That's gambling with the future of European security, of all of our lives. And unfortunately, the reality is that Ukraine, as I just said, is more of a core interest to Russia than it is to us. So it could be that Russia, under such circumstances, would only escalate because they're not prepared to lose. So in a game of chicken, there's no guarantee, even though we're the more powerful actor, in a game of chicken, if that's what we want to play, there's no guarantee that we're going to emerge on the upside of that. The problem is the European security order is not unipolar. We cannot unilaterally dictate terms. There's another power, it's called Russia. Whether we like it or not, they're going to have a say. And one last thing on this front, it's not 1944. In 1944, we were facing up against a superpower that had conquered the entirety of the European peninsula, right? That had, erected an empire from Brest almost all the way to Moscow. The balance of power today in Europe is far more favorable to us. It has taken Russia months and months and months just to take Bakhmut. They're not going to be marching tomorrow on Warsaw or on Berlin. And so whether we have this collective will to, face up against Russia, to some extent, it's not going to be there because the balance of power is already favorable enough to us. We don't have to escalate to that level in order to ensure our own security, nor should we, right? So I think prudent decision-making, a degree of dialogue is going to be necessary. Yes, relations with Russia at this point have descended to the point where deterrence is going to be an enormous part of the relationship with Russia going forward. That is inevitable. But deterrence only works when you have a degree of reassurance and dialogue on the side. Otherwise, it leads to brinksmanship, right? So, rather than going through counterfactuals all the time, let's talk about what we can know, what we do know, and, let's move forward, having learned some of the lessons of the past into a slightly safer future.
Rebuttal.
Yes, peace and war. I think Russia, through its hybrid attacks against the West, is exactly dissolving this border. We still pretend that these are two completely different, like black and white, two separate things. And we say, yeah, we're not at war with Russia. Whatever Russia is doing in terms of attacks, poisoning people and killing people, cyber attacks. Actually, we have seen some direct sabotage acts already, and this will get much more intense in the near future. And we still pretend that peace and war are two completely separate things. NATO members are completely covered by Article 5 and guarantees, and whoever is outside of NATO is not covered by anything. It is this very distinction into black and white, which is encouraging Russia to do whatever they want, as Trump would say, whatever the hell they want, with countries outside of Article 5, right? We need to be much more creative in making this border porous. And thereby, and this is my second point, there is a thing called deterrence. You can call it game of chicken, you can call it brinksmanship. I call it deterrence, which has worked very well during the Cold War, and which actually has worked even after the end of the Cold War. It is just when we started getting soft on deterrence, because we were emphasizing de-escalation and dialogue even after the worst acts of aggression by Russia, that we got the situation which we're getting now. Who's doing the gambling, Zach? You're saying that, okay, yeah, let's stop pretending that we're gonna really help Ukraine defend itself. Let's withdraw, so to speak, to NATO territory, and then Putin will leave us alone. I would call that the gamble. That's the big gamble, and the eastern flank countries of NATO and the European Union are telling us exactly, no, actually every second NATO general that is present in the media said in the last couple of weeks and months that we have to be prepared for, doesn't mean wage, but we have to be prepared for war with Russia. So this goes far beyond Ukraine, or even Moldova and other countries in the eastern neighborhood of the European Union. So I think the very mistake we made was to actually distinguish so clearly between war and peace and between membership and non-membership of NATO. That's my response to your arguments about the brinkmanship. Every deterrence is brinkmanship. Deterrence means that you have the capabilities, the political will to respond to a threat and even to escalate, by the way. You know, deterrence is the readiness to escalate in a targeted manner. Have the capacity, have the willingness, and communicate this to the other side. And we've been lacking on all 3 points in the last couple of years.
Quick response, Zach?
Sure, I mean, yeah, there's an element of willingness to escalate in deterrence. I don't deny that. But again, it goes back to what I just said. It's a question of who actually perceives themselves to have core interests. And there are some core interests that actually are red lines. And just because several red lines or alleged red lines have been crossed today, doesn't mean that Russia doesn't have any red lines at all. And I don't think we want to be putting ourselves in a situation where we actually cross across a real red line and then we only find out about it too late, right? So willingness to escalate, fine, but the willingness to escalate needs to be credible in the first place. The other side in the equation needs to believe that your willingness to escalate is credible. And that's not the case in Ukraine, because Russia knows at this point that its interests are more significant in Ukraine than ours. We've telegraphed that to them multiple times. We've already done it. It's already done. It's in the past. There's no changing that. There's no way you can possibly change that. We have been dragging our feet on bringing Ukraine into NATO since 2008. We've been so hesitant, right? So all of a sudden, if we were to offer them NATO membership tomorrow, Russia would buy that we're automatically now we're finally serious about being committed to Ukraine's security. If we brought them into NATO, Russia could immediately choose to test whether or not we're committed to their security and launch a limited incursion into Ukraine, at which point we have two options. Either we invoke Article 5, we respond, and we end up with World War III, or we don't respond, in which case Article 5's credibility is shot across all of Europe, and there's no more deterrence at all for anyone. It's a bad idea to bring Ukraine into NATO. It's not going to be credible in the first place. I agree we have to clarify Ukraine's status, its security status. We're on the same page. I think it's a bad idea to have black holes, to have gray zones, etc. Right? But it just can't be in NATO. It can't. It's too late.
No, it's not about NATO membership tomorrow for Ukraine. It's about a serious commitment to Ukraine's survival as a country. And we could muster, if we showed some kind of leadership in the West, with a Churchillian moment, blood, sweat, toil, and tears. Because this is existential. We're not yet in 1943 or 44. But we'll end up there very quickly.
Roland, it's another World War II metaphor coming from you. Not everything is World War II, right? A Churchillian moment, it's 1944, it's this or that. We're living in a different situation right now, right? So
people take their inspirations from such key moments of the past. That's what leadership is all about. And if we showed leadership, we would be in a better situation today.
And just to clarify, I am not suggesting that there's any guarantee that if we were to adopt a different strategy, if we were to cut a deal with Russia tomorrow over the status of Ukraine, right? There's no guarantee that this will not lead to further problems in our relationship with Russia down the road. We are going to have a relationship with Russia that is going to be based on an evolving mixture of deterrence and dialogue, and it's going to have to be managed carefully for a long time. There's no endpoint to which we finally achieved all of our strategic goals and it's over. The question is, and I think you rightly pointed to it, what's the better bet? Is the better bet telegraphing our non-credible intention to escalate over something that clearly we are not prepared to escalate over? Or is it showing elements of restraint, but at the same time showing, in a committed fashion, where our red lines actually are? And I agree, our red line should be preserving Ukraine's independence and sovereignty as a state. Where its border is, that's a question. I think the norm of territorial integrity is a very important norm. We should reaffirm it. Resolving Ukraine's particular case of territorial integrity is going to take a long time. Just like there have been territorial integrity related disputes in Europe and throughout the world for a long time that don't get resolved. Doesn't mean that the norm is not important. Nonetheless, we need to be credible in what we telegraph, and the way that we are credible about it is being more limited in what we're actually prepared to telegraph. If we're telegraphing, we're with you for as long as it takes, As long as it takes to do what? I don't know. To regain all Ukrainian territory? Well, certainly not. That's not going to happen. To put Ukraine in a position where it's stronger on the battlefield so it can dictate terms to Russia? Well, that's not going to happen. What's it prepared to negotiate? We don't know. What's Russia prepared to negotiate? We don't know. What leverage we have actually to coax Russia to the negotiating table? Again, we don't know. Russia might choose to escalate rather than, as it has done, by the way, at every single turn so far, Russia has chosen to escalate rather than come to the negotiating table, right? Including in the autumn of 2022, when Russia chose to conduct a partial mobilization and annex 4 Ukrainian regions, rather, than back down in the face of significant Ukrainian military gains, right? So we don't have that leverage. And part of the reason why we don't have leverage is because we're not actually prepared to talk about the issues that matter to the Kremlin. And that includes discussing Ukraine's security status, right? We're not prepared to do that because we're maintaining this fiction that Ukraine has some sort of right to join NATO, even though we're not actually prepared to extend NATO membership to them. So we're fighting this war indefinitely, it seems, over the principle that Ukraine has a theoretical right to join NATO, even though we're never prepared actually to offer that tangible membership. It seems absurd to me. That doesn't mean that you compromise on absolutely everything, but it does mean at some point you have to think about, what's the best way forward here, in the question of stability.
Zach, you're getting totally hooked on this Ukraine membership of NATO thing without discussing the actual issue is how do we generate the political will to actually become credible in our deterrence of Russia? By the way, Russia has not escalated all the time. There are numerous red lines that Russia has drawn, such as tanks, such as fighter planes, such as other weapon systems, attacking the territory of Russia proper, from which there were attacks, and so on. Okay.
How are you going to generate the political will? How do you convince someone in rural France that their interests in defending eastern Ukraine are greater than the interests of someone on the other side of the border?
No one is even trying. The Polish saying no because no, nie, bo nie. This is what you're doing. You're saying, oh, well, the political will is not there. Let's not even try.
Let's check what's the temperature in the room. One very quick question from the audience. Something we're missing, an emphatic point, 10-second question, comment. The lady was first, sorry. It was first gets the floor, please.
Yeah, my question.
It's only a quick comment to navigate this conversation.
Anything from the 1990s that we didn't do, we should have done. It seemed to sort of provide a lot of enrichment of kleptocracies at that point that now support Putin. So could we have done more at that point?
Question to both or specifically to Zach?
Both, I guess.
Both.
Would they have something to say on it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, and there might be others who are, students of Russian history who are better placed to answer this question than I am, but, I think that the dynamic of the intertwined nature of economic and political power in Russia, began already to settle in with the collapse of communism in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Did we help to drive that to some extent? Yes, but I mean, I think that in every country's case, endogenous factors, domestic factors are the most important determining factors when it comes to certain outcomes. So, Russia was going to be structured in some kind of way, in all likelihood, as the previous regime was collapsing. It's just a question of degree. But certainly many things that we did do, throughout the 1990s did create this meta-narrative that the West was interested in weakening Russia. And that was one of the things, basically, that shock therapy helped to, bring about the situation in which you had the decomposition of political power within Russia, the decentralization of political power within Russia, which led to total chaos. And that this was not, just an accident, but it is something that the West actually wanted, right? They benefited from a weak Russia. That's the narrative that was generated, and other Western actions, Yugoslavia, in Libya in 2011, et cetera, helped to bake that narrative in. Does it mean that that narrative is true? No, but it is genuinely held by the majority of the Russian population. And so as far as they're concerned, it's true. And we have to deal with the Russia that exists rather than the Russia that we would like to exist.
Well, just on this last point, I agree with what you said about corruption in the beginning, but Free Russia Foundation spends a lot of our time and energy on messaging to the Russian population. And we've got millions of followers. If you count all the podcasts, and there's Fyodor Krashenikov in the last row sitting here, who makes a daily podcast to Russia in Russian. We are sending the signal, don't believe everything that you're told on television. Don't believe everything that the regime is trying to tell you. So if that was much more of a Western strategy to directly address Russians, then such misconceptions as you described them would maybe be a little bit less popular in Russia.
I don't know if that's true though, and just to finish on this point, yeah, I think we're at a point now where Russians know what they watch on TV is propaganda. It's just that they trust, their own propaganda more than they trust the West. And that says something about
their own lies more than the lies.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because we've also behaved in a way that has not necessarily engendered their trust. And even if there were to be regime change tomorrow in Russia, the new Russia would be facing a West that is, in terms of its normative power and influence, far less influential than the West was in the late 80s and early 1990s. The normative and ideological power of liberalism in Russia the day after regime change would be far, far less than it was 30 years ago. And 30 years ago wasn't enough to conquer Russian society. It's very hard to imagine that it will today.
Well, I tell you what, whoever follows Putin will, and I'm formulating it very, very carefully, deliberately. Whoever follows Putin will have tremendous incentives in that Polish crisis, which Russia is facing already and will be openly facing then, will have tremendous incentives to do some things fundamentally different from Putin. That I think can be said as a probability. And by the way, everything's counterfactual that we're saying here. Yeah, would have, if, yes, then, and so on. That's why I'm trying to make a case here, right? But I know that there's no proof or disproof of whatever I'm saying.
Sure, just final minute frame this conversation. Question to both on endgame. The West collectively says we are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes. Maybe we make some moves on additional weapon supply. Maybe we allow them to attack Russian territory and so forth. Maybe just to give the Ukrainians this time yet an advantage. But what is the end game of the West, Roland? If we stick to this narrative that we're here for the long run, won't this cost Ukrainian lives, hardship, throughout? How does the West collectively see its end game with this strategy? Or maybe put forward something more rash?
It's honestly, Ukrainians have decided to fight for survival. We should honor that. And Ukrainians will have to decide under what circumstances, with which kind of concrete goal they want to end this war. And the war, we all know, would have been ended long ago if Russia had stopped its aggression, okay? Since that doesn't seem to be happening, Ukraine has to be enabled to force Russia to negotiate or stop its aggression and somehow come to terms with the crimes it has committed, like other countries have come to terms with the crimes they have committed. And there is a very intricate interrelationship between the future of Putin, or future of Putinism, I should say, in Moscow, and the actual development of the war. And I'm not saying this is a chicken and egg game, and I think both questions are closely related. So the war will only be finished if Putin is severely weakened, or which will actually mean his end in one way or the other. And Ukraine winning a decisive advantage in this war is a necessary but not sufficient condition for any regime change in Moscow. So that's the interrelationship. So both things are going to happen somewhere in parallel, maybe in little incremental steps, but both processes, the end of Putinism and the end of the war, are very, very closely connected. And we need to do everything to enable Ukrainians to bring this about.
Zach,
Okay.
thoughts on the end game?
Yeah, okay, so just a few things. First of all, I don't know how you want Ukraine to win the war when they don't have enough men. If you want to hold territory, you need enough men. They don't have enough men. I know you say that Ukraine wants to keep fighting. There are videos coming out of Ukraine every day of men being dragged, kicking and screaming at the military recruitment centers at this point. After Putin, who knows who comes after Putin? It could be someone more nationalist, more revanchist, more aggressive, who will say, oh, I know why we didn't win the war. It's because the Putin regime is kleptocratic and corrupt, and I'm a true Russian nationalist. I'm going to deliver us true victory. We don't know what comes after Putin. It's not a good strategy for us to envisage that as a potential endgame. It's not good enough for our security because we don't know what comes next, right? So, what's the endgame? I would like to see one be defined. I think it's an embarrassment that after more than 2 years of this war, we have not gone further in the West than as long as it takes. As long as it takes to do what, it's not clear. I understand the appeal of that at the beginning because it allowed us to have some, strategic flexibility, some room for maneuver. The time for that has long passed, and we are providing weapons. So we have a say to some extent over, the direction in which this war goes. It's not just Ukraine. We don't just outsource all decision-making of our own security to Kiev. That's not how it's going to work. So we have to define what our core interests are, what our red lines are. I think they should include the survival of Ukraine as an independent country. I think they should include clear security status of some kind for Ukraine. And then, that's probably going to have to involve some kind of defensive strategy going forward, which is going to be much more credible than what we have right now, premised on defending the territory that Ukraine currently has, because the longer the war goes on, the less and less, more and more territorial gains become advantageous to Ukraine as a country, because those territorial gains, if they do happen at all, are going to come at the loss of so many men, at the loss of future economic potential for Ukraine, human potential for Ukraine. And Ukrainians are beginning to realize this already. And they're not prepared to bend over backwards to compromise on everything when it comes to Russia. They're not. But the fact that people are being dragged kicking and screaming, and the military recruitment, legislation in Russia has been, postponed, in Ukraine, has been postponed for as long as it has, reveals the extent to which it's unpopular. So I think we need to avoid in our discourse this monistic understanding of all these different countries about, Ukraine is like this, Ukrainians want this, etc. Ukraine is a diverse country. It has mounted a heroic resistance. It came together at a very important time to be able to resist Russia's completely illegal and reprehensible act of aggression. But that doesn't mean that we can extrapolate on into the future, that this is how things are always going to be for the next few years. It's a very dangerous time, better to err on the side of caution, especially at a time when it is unbelievably clear that Russia is prepared to escalate to a far greater degree than we are.
Great time to involve the rest of the audience. The gentleman was very patient with the question and the lady as well. So thanks for the patience.
About patience and the question actually are the same. But the question, what is the end game? And the thing, as long as it takes. How much time do we have, and how much time do we want to invest, and how much resources? Why I'm asking this? Look at Afghanistan, 20 years of engagement and running away. So the picture which this gave or gives to the world, that's what we put in this. We just have to wait and people run away. And Russia has time. What you see, the resources which they throw into that war, I don't know, it is now 500,000 missing persons, is it 1 million, no one knows. The thing about resources, tanks, building tanks, they have time. And they were, you know how the propaganda is working, and the propaganda is actually quite good, because they point on the weaknesses, they look at German media, and in German media, the state of the mindset in Germany is very shaky these days. And you just take it out and you go to, what is this? Solovyov and the other guys. What is it? The 16 minutes. And they take these things out.
Question on the end game. Okay. And lady, second question.
Yes, again in the news from NATO, but I'm not going to talk about Ukraine in NATO. So I would like to introduce perhaps another, in a way, the economy into the discussion. Because I think we often say that it's about imperialism and Russia has its interest in Ukraine. But is it not also valid to think about this is about democracy on one side and totalitarian regime, if not a fascist regime on the other side. So taking your argument, I mean that Putin decided to invade Ukraine. You can go back and say, yeah, he also decided to annex Crimea. He decided to have that war with Georgia. So what did Putin ultimately do to become the totalitarian ruler he is these days? in many ways, is he not accountable for his own deeds? Yeah, as a human being, because that's what he still is. And if that is the case, and the whole conflict is largely about democracy on one side and totalitarianism on the other side, then then eventually, I mean, indeed, we have to support Ukraine to maintain its democracy status. No? So I would be interested in getting your.
Thank you.
On
Thank
this
you.
economy on.
Lady in the back, thank you.
Well, a question to Dr. Paikin. If we have to admit Russia to the table, what do we do with our fundamental values? So up to now, they managed to violate the UN Charter. There is the crime of aggression. So do we have to rewrite the NATO and EU treaties? Do we have to shift the focus towards their values, which I don't clearly identify as democratic? How can we accommodate them, or even on the OSCE Charter? I mean, they really managed to violate the whole set.
Yeah, thank you. Roland, the first two questions go to you. The end game is a chance to also respond to the previous one, and also maybe democracy versus authoritarianism.
Yeah, democracy versus autocracy is a global thing at the moment. It's not, again, it's not a black and white thing. It's not the new Cold War 2.0. I would conceive democracies and their allies as in concentric circles. I mean, at the core, there's a Euro-Atlantic alliance, and there are like-minded democracies around the world. And then there is a group of autocracies that are non-lethal, as I would put it, that do not want to undermine or destroy our democracy because they conceive of its very existence as a threat to their rule. So, you know, that's the way I would, but that's just an extension of what you said. Of course, the Ukraine's fight for survival is also a question of, can democracies somehow hold the ground against increasingly aggressive autocracies? Coming back to Zach, I think we're not in this, the age we're in is not one where just the number of men and women in the battlefield determine victory or defeat. Ukraine has actually demonstrated how in particular situations with superior creativity and technology, you can actually win a battle with much smaller numbers than the aggressor has. And yes, we want to maintain a viable Ukrainian democracy with territorial integrity, a judicial responsibility by the aggressor, some kind of material damages being paid for the damage caused, and viable Ukraine. And I want to finish on that note. You know as well as I do, Zach, that any Ukrainian president who signs a peace deal now, which involves Putin's demand for even sitting down at the negotiating table, you know, recognizing the territorial realities, which means the four regions. So Ukraine would have to withdraw from territory it currently still holds in the regions of Donbass and others. You know, any Ukrainian president who signs that kind of deal will not live very long. And we could very well see a Ukraine which actually then becomes what the Russian ambassador to NATO at the Brussels forum of the GMF like 10 years ago called a black hole in the middle of Europe. Yes, that is a concrete possibility if we throw Ukraine under the bus by forcing it to come to an agreement with Putin's Russia. You know, there will be no peace, that's for sure.
Zach, how do we sit with Russia at the same table? The question.
Okay, so I got two questions and then to respond to Roland. So democracy versus autocracy does not define the status of contemporary geopolitics. Because today we are not just in a European security order, the European security order is nested within a global order. And right now we've just seen, literally just in Switzerland, at a peace summit for Ukraine, who did not sign the final communique? Brazil, Indonesia, India, South Africa. These are leading democracies from the global south, right? But who have a different approach towards this conflict than we do. I think it's a very bad idea if we want to influence the future of the global order, not just the future of the European order, to telegraph in any way the message that countries' sovereignty is somehow contingent on their regime type. I think a much better model is the model that George H.W. Bush put forward when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq. The emphasis was, this is an act of unprovoked aggression, this is a violation of international law, we need to act in the interest of collective security to restore Kuwaiti sovereignty. Make it about international law, don't make it about regime type. Because it's a confused message. On the one hand, we're saying we're defending the rules-based international order. On the other hand, we're saying it's all about democracy versus autocracy, which doesn't exactly, reflect the actual, situation in today's world. And so it's a very mixed message we're sending out, and it's made our own ability to convince the rest of the world to come around to our position reduced. On your question, ma'am. So I heard UN Charter, NATO, and the Helsinki Decalogue. I think that Russia is far from the only country that has violated the UN Charter. I think the United States did a very good job of doing that when it invaded Iraq, when NATO attacked Yugoslavia, when NATO perhaps exceeded, the mandate that the UN Security Council had provided it under the aegis of R2P in 2011 in Libya. There's no shortage of times in which Western countries have violated the UN Charter. So the idea that the West is synonymous with the UN Charter, and if we make some kind of a compromise with Russia, by definition, that means that the UN Charter is a dead letter. Well, the same thing could be said the other way around. If Russia wanted to have good relations with us in 2003, that must mean that they're willing to throw the UN Charter under the bus. That's not true. That's not the way it is. In the case of NATO, yes, the future European security order will not be NATO-centric. The future European security order will not be based on the notion that NATO countries will decide amongst themselves what their collective positions are, and then basically talk to Russia, for formalistic engagement purposes, but at the end of the day, they're going to be dictating terms. That's not how the future European security order is going to work. The Helsinki Final Act, yes, Russia has violated the Decalogue. I do not deny that at all. However, we need to ask ourselves the question. In the future, we are going to have to rebuild the European security order at some point. When we do so, do we want to do it on the basis of the existing Helsinki principles, or do we want to do it based on new principles with no guarantee that we're going to be able to agree on principles that are necessarily better than the Helsinki principles? So it's better to keep Russia in, keep them in the OSCE for now, so that it exists at some point in the future when we need it, when we actually have to rebuild European security, which ideally will be on Helsinki aspirations and principles. Final point to Roland, because I think you want to wrap things up over here. First of all, technology is great. Technology is great, but technology does not hold land. Men hold land at the end of the day, and we've made this conflict, unfortunately, about land, about restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity, when this war really isn't about land. It's about Ukraine's security status. That is the formal justification for which Russia launched the war, and so that's the issue that we have to clarify. Would Ukraine be facing a bad deal right now? Undeniably. But the fact is that Ukraine had a better deal on the table in Minsk, and they had a better deal on the table in Istanbul than they're facing right now. So, the deeper we dig this hole, the worse and worse a deal Ukraine seems to be getting. Now, Ukraine, unfortunately, is not going to get a better deal when it's related just to Ukraine in and of itself in the battlefield there, because there, Russia's in a better position and the stakes are higher for Russia than they are for us. Where we can change Russia's calculus is on broader issues related to the European security order, strategic stability, etc. And if we're prepared to offer them something there, we can hopefully get a deal that's better for Ukraine. Does that guarantee that there will never be war between Russia and Ukraine in the future? No, it does not. There's no guarantee, ever. But there's no guarantee in the scenario that you're proposing either, right?
Okay, final word from my side, and then it's time for some refreshments. Look, a deal with Putin is a deal with someone whose signature is not worth the paper it is written on, and he has broken through. He has steamrolled previous commitments, from the Budapest Memorandum to actually Minsk, yes, which foresaw Ukrainian controls at the borders and the withdrawal of foreign forces. He has steamrolled his own commitments so many times that no deal with Putin is worth anything. And frankly speaking, future European security order, we will only be able to sleep better than we are sleeping now if Russia is a different country, if Russia is a free country. And then it will still need a lot of follow-up by Western countries and other countries in the world in holding Russia to its commitments. But that the kind of Russia that we're facing today, we can try to kick the can down the road, but the risk is that we will enter a conflict later with much more intensity and a much more dramatic one. So the world will be even more dangerous by that time. And that's why we need to do the right thing now. We need to develop the political will. And yes, historical examples are a little bit quaint sometimes, but I do think that the history of the 20th century and the way democracies actually fared in World War II and afterwards can still be a great inspiration for us today. Thanks.
Thanks. We went 5 minutes over time, but I thank you for your patience. I think in this panel, our lovely experts packed in more content ideas than half a dozen of these panels in Brussels. So thank you so much, Zachary and Roland, for your expertise, and thank you for your time.
And
Drinks
one
are
last thing, compliment to Zach, because he very succinctly and logically summarized a position which is still held by a lot of people in Brussels, but they would never dare to speak in public. So thank you guys.